Be me, Nate, 28. Work in IT at some mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous, just keep servers from dying and answer tickets about forgotten passwords. Live in a decent apartment, have a car, cook my own food, generally functioning human being. Been in a relationship with my girlfriend Sloan for about a year and a half at this point. Met her at a mutual friend's birthday thing. Crowded apartment, somebody's Spotify playlist nobody asked for. She was standing near the kitchen counter, talking loudly about something, confident, had a lot to say. At the time that seemed like a good thing. She was funny in a sharp kind of way, quick with a comeback, seemed like she actually had opinions and wasn't afraid to share them. We started talking, and I remember thinking she was genuinely interesting. Exchanged numbers, started texting, went on a few dates, the whole normal sequence. She works at some marketing agency, does copywriting and social media strategy for brands. Smart girl, no question about that. The thing I didn't fully clock in the beginning was that her opinions weren't just opinions. They were more like a system, a whole framework for how things should work, how people should behave, what relationships should look like. Which, again, in theory, not a problem. Everyone has ideas about stuff. The issue was, her ideas came pre-packaged with a specific label attached, and if you disagreed, you weren't just disagreeing, you were proving something. Within the first few months, she started dropping certain phrases pretty regularly. Things like toxic masculinity, emotional unavailability, controlling behavior, that kind of vocabulary. I'm not going to pretend I found it charming, but I also didn't think much of it at first. Assumed it was just how she talked and that it would kind of level out once we got more comfortable. It didn't really level out. If anything, it got more frequent the more comfortable she got. She had this way of framing things where, if I reacted to something she did in a way she didn't like, the reaction itself became the problem, not what caused the reaction, just the reaction. I'd be annoyed about something reasonable, and somehow by the time the conversation ended, we were talking about my emotional regulation. This happened enough times that I started noticing the pattern. Early on, maybe 3 or 4 months in, she came home frustrated about something at work. A project had gone badly and her manager had been dismissive about it. I listened, said her manager sounded like an idiot, asked what she needed. She said she just needed to vent, so I let her vent without trying to fix anything. Thought I was doing the right thing. Later that same night, she said she felt like I wasn't fully present during the conversation, that I seemed distracted. I wasn't distracted. I was sitting there listening. But somehow, by the end of that conversation, I was apologizing for not being emotionally available enough. It was a small thing, I know, but it set a precedent. I noticed I started putting more effort into demonstrating that I was engaged during conversations, leaning forward more, making more eye contact, reflecting back what she said. Basically performing attentiveness, because actual attentiveness was never quite enough. And the frustrating part was that she wasn't cruel about it. Not exactly. She framed everything as wanting to communicate better, wanting a healthier dynamic. Who's going to argue against that? Nobody. That's the genius of the framing. You agree to the principle, and then the principle gets applied unevenly, and by the time you notice that, you've already agreed. Eventually I learned to pick my battles, which is probably not the healthiest thing, but that's where things were. The topic that came up more than anything else, the one she had the firmest position on, was male and female friendships. Sloan genuinely believed, and said out loud often, that men and women can absolutely be just friends. That jealousy over opposite-sex friendships is a sign of insecurity. That demanding your partner cut off their friends because of gender is controlling behavior. That healthy, mature adults don't have those kinds of hang-ups. She said this stuff in conversations, said it around friends, said it as casual statements of obvious fact. The way you'd say the sky is blue or that pineapple on pizza is divisive. Just dropped it into conversation like it wasn't even worth debating. And look, I don't think the idea is completely wrong. I've had female friends my whole life. It's not like I think men and women can't spend time together without something happening. But in a relationship, context matters. Frequency matters, patterns matter, the nature of the dynamic matters. I wasn't trying to dictate who she could talk to. I was just a person with eyes who noticed things. Sloan had a best friend named Caden. I want to be clear that I have no actual evidence that anything ever happened between them, or that Caden ever tried anything. But the dynamic was not what I'd describe as typical male-female friendship. They texted every single day, not a quick check-in, like actual full conversations throughout the day. I'd see her phone light up while we were watching something together, and she'd pick it up and start typing back immediately. Sometimes she'd laugh at something he sent and show me the screen, like that made it better somehow. They got coffee together probably once every week or two, sometimes more. There was this particular energy whenever Caden came up in conversation, like she'd get a little more animated, a little lighter. Not that she was cold the rest of the time, just that there was a specific quality to it. I noticed it. I'm not an idiot. The one time I tried to bring it up carefully, not accusatory, just saying, "Hey, this dynamic makes me a little uncomfortable sometimes." It went badly. She looked at me like I'd said something deeply embarrassing, said that this was exactly the kind of insecurity she was talking about, that Caden was her friend and she wasn't going to manage a friendship to soothe my ego, that if I trusted her, I wouldn't have a problem with it, that the problem wasn't Caden. The problem was that I apparently didn't understand what healthy relationships look like. By the end of it, I felt like the conversation had never been about Caden at all. It had been about what my concern revealed about me as a person. She used the phrase toxic masculinity at some point in that conversation. Not yelling it, just deploying it. Like a technical term for the thing I was doing. I remember sitting there after and thinking about how that works. You raise a concern, the concern gets reclassified as a symptom, and now, instead of discussing the original thing, you're discussing your character. Clean move, actually. I dropped it. Learned not to bring it up. This is how it worked. She had the framework and the vocabulary, and if I pushed back, I was confirming the diagnosis. Toxic masculinity, controlling behavior, insecurity. Pick your label, it was waiting for me at the end of any disagreement, so I stopped disagreeing about that particular topic. What I did instead was nothing. Went quiet about it, the way you go. Quiet about things when you figure out there's no good outcome to talking. Here's the thing though. I did actually have female friends. Not many. I'm not the type to have a huge social circle, but a few. One of them was Haley. Haley and I had known each other since we were in our early 20s, met through a coworker at my first job. We'd never dated, never had anything romantic. She had a boyfriend for most of the time I'd known her. We'd grab food occasionally, text here and there, nothing intense, just solid, comfortable friendship. The kind of friendship where you can go 2 months without really talking and then pick up exactly where you left off. No pressure, no agenda, just two people who got along and checked in when it made sense. When I started dating Sloane, Haley and I were already friends, and Sloane knew this from early on. More than that, Sloane had actually met Haley a couple of times. Once at some casual thing a mutual friend organized. Once when Haley and I happened to be in the same area, and Sloane came to meet me. In fact, at some point Sloane had said something like, "Haley seems really cool. I'm glad you have a friend like that." Said it sincerely, not through gritted teeth. Made a point of it, actually. Like it was something she approved of, and was demonstrating that she approved of it. A kind of, here's me being enlightened about this. Notice how I'm not being weird about it. I remember thinking at the time that this was good, that there was no issue there, that she'd walk the walk the same way she talked the talk. All of this is context for what happened later. So some amount of time into the relationship, maybe around the year mark or somewhere after that, things had settled into a certain rhythm. Not a bad rhythm exactly, just a specific one. I'd learned which topics to avoid. She'd learned that I wasn't going to fight her on most things. We got along fine when we weren't in disagreement territory. We'd watch things together, cook sometimes, go out with friends occasionally. Her friends more than mine, if I'm being honest. But that's just how it ended up. Her social circle was bigger and more active. People always had something going on. I didn't mind it, mostly. Just meant that I was often in rooms where I didn't know most people that well. Russ, my closest friend, didn't hang out with us much. Not because there was any bad blood, just because Sloane and Russ didn't really have much to say to each other. Russ is the type of guy who can read a room in about 4 seconds, and he'd read that room and decided it wasn't his scene. He'd ask how things were going with Sloane sometimes. I'd give him the neutral version. He wouldn't push it. Good friend, knew when to leave things alone. We still saw each other separately, a couple of times a month. Watch sports or whatever. Normal stuff. There's a version of the relationship where you gradually phase out your own friends because it's easier, and you don't notice until something happens and they're not there anymore. I was aware enough to not let that happen entirely. Anyway, at some point in all of this, I got a message from Haley. She'd seen an announcement about this photography exhibition at a gallery not too far from where I lived. I'd mentioned to her a while back that I was into photography, had been thinking about getting more serious about it as a hobby. I'd picked up a decent camera secondhand, been doing some weekend shooting. Nothing impressive yet, but I was enjoying learning. She remembered, sent me the link, said she was thinking of going, and asked if I wanted to come along. It wasn't a complicated invitation. 2 friends, an exhibition, maybe coffee after. The kind of thing we'd done maybe 3 or 4 times over the years, without it ever being anything other than what it was. I looked at the message and I had this moment, it wasn't long, where I just thought about it. I thought about the framework. I thought about Sloane's whole philosophy. Men and women can be friends. Jealousy is insecurity. Healthy, mature adults don't have hang-ups about this. Caden texts her every day, and they get coffee. And that's fine, because friendship is friendship. Haley is my friend of several years. Sloane has met her. Sloane said she liked her. By every standard Sloane had ever publicly stated, this was not only acceptable, but basically the ideal example of exactly the kind of friendship she was always talking about. So, I said yes. Told Haley, yeah, that sounds good. When is it? We figured out a day. It was a weekend afternoon, nothing secretive about it. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I did not hide it. That same evening I mentioned it to Sloane. Just brought it up casually while we were in the kitchen. Something like, hey, Haley reached out. There's this photography thing at a gallery. I'm going to go check it out with her this weekend. The way you'd mention any normal plan. Sloane went quiet for a second. Not a dramatic pause. Just a beat. Then she said something like, oh, okay. But the way she said it had this particular quality. Like the words were neutral, but the delivery wasn't. I watched her for a second and she had already moved on to whatever she was doing, but something had shifted slightly. I didn't push it. I'd said what I had to say, she'd said okay. That was the conversation. I did not apologize for the plan. I did not offer to cancel. I did not ask permission. I just went about the rest of the evening. The thing was, she couldn't say anything. That's what I understood in that moment. She'd built this entire position publicly and consistently over 1.5 years of our relationship. She'd lectured me about trusting her with Caden, using exactly this logic. Friendship is friendship. Jealousy is a character flaw. Mature people don't act like that. There was no version of objecting to my plans with Haley that didn't completely collapse everything she'd ever said, and she knew that. So she said, okay, and we didn't discuss it further. The day of the exhibition came around. Haley and I met outside the gallery. It was a decent afternoon, not too cold, the kind of day that doesn't require thinking about the weather. We went in, walked through the exhibition. It was genuinely good. A series by some photographer I hadn't heard of, mostly black and white street work. Really sharp composition. The kind of stuff where you stop in front of a photo and stay there longer than you intended. We talked about the photos, about photography in general, about what makes a shot interesting versus just technically correct. She told me about a camera she'd been thinking about getting. I gave her my completely unqualified opinion based on 3 months of being a hobbyist. Nothing happened. I want to write that in bold, but this is a text document, so I'll just say it plainly. Nothing happened. We looked at photographs and then we went to a coffee place nearby and sat for maybe an hour and talked about the usual things. How work was going, what we'd both been watching, some mutual acquaintance drama that I only half remembered. She asked a bit about how things were with Sloane, and I gave her the neutral version. Same as I gave Russ. She didn't press it. Normal conversation between 2 people who've known each other for years and have no agenda. At some point during the coffee, I took a couple of photos with my phone. The cups, the window light, just messing around with angles. Haley laughed at me for being that guy in a coffee shop. I told her that learning starts somewhere. She said technically that was true. I sent one of the photos to a group chat with Russ and a couple of other guys I knew. Just the photo and a caption about lighting. Completely inconsequential. Russ reacted to it with something like, looks like a date to me. I sent back a thumbs down. Then, a few minutes later, he sent a private message. Are you doing what I think you're doing? I said I was just going to an exhibition with a friend. He sent back some meme about a guy tapping his head and then nothing else. I laughed and put my phone down. Haley and I wrapped up, went our separate ways. I drove home. The evening was completely normal. Sloane was home, we made dinner. She didn't ask many questions about how it went. Asked one, something like, was it good? I said, yeah, it was a nice exhibition. And that was it. No interrogation, no scene, just a very controlled, neutral response. I thought maybe that was the end of it, that the weekend thing would pass without incident and life would continue. It mostly did for a while. Haley and I started texting a little more after that. Not a lot, just more than we had been. She sent me an article about a photographer she thought I'd find interesting. I sent back some thoughts on it. We had an actual back and forth about one of the photos from the exhibition, different opinions on the composition. She mentioned another event at a different venue a few weeks out. I said I'd think about it. Basic stuff. The kind of low-stakes ongoing conversation that's just what regular friends do. I wasn't doing anything to engineer this or to make a point. I was genuinely just engaging with a friend. But I noticed that I wasn't second-guessing it the way I used to second-guess things in this relationship. Usually there was this low-level monitoring process running in the background. Is this going to cause a thing? Do I need to be careful about how I word this? Is this going to come up later as evidence of something? It wasn't there anymore, because I didn't have to. The rules had been established, loudly and publicly, over a long time. I was following them. Sloane started being slightly more attentive to what I was doing on my phone. Not obvious about it, not saying anything, but I'd catch the angle of her attention shifting when I was texting. We'd be on the couch watching something, and I'd pick up my phone to reply to a message, and I could feel the change in the room. Small things. The way she'd pause whatever we were watching and say nothing. The way she'd glance at me and then look away. She asked once who I was texting, casually, almost like she didn't care. I said Haley just as casually and went back to what I was doing. Another pause, another okay, another slightly off delivery. That word, okay, was doing a lot of heavy lifting in our apartment during this period. Russ asked me around this time how things were going. The real version. We were at his place watching a game, and he just asked outright during a commercial break. I gave him a little more of it this time. Told him about the cadence situation, about the framework, about how the same logic was now applying to Haley. Told him about the gallery day and the increasingly tense okays. He listened through the whole thing without interrupting, which is unusual for him. Then he said something like, "You realize what you're doing, right?" I said I was just being consistent with the rules she'd set. He said, yeah, that's what he meant. Sat there for a second and then said that watching this situation develop was going to be the most entertaining thing he'd witnessed in a long time. I told him to stop enjoying himself so much. He said he absolutely could not promise that. Handed me a drink and we went back to the game. But he also said something else before we dropped it. Said that however this ended, I shouldn't forget that I hadn't done anything wrong. That was the thing he wanted to be clear about. I appreciated it. Things continued like this for a few weeks. Sloane getting more tense in these small ways she couldn't really name out loud. Me continuing to do exactly what I'd always been allowed to do. Talk to my friend, make plans sometimes, not hide any of it. The dynamic had shifted in a way I couldn't fully articulate, but could definitely feel. For a year and a half, I'd been the one carefully managing myself, monitoring what I said, learning which topics set things off. Now there was a different energy in the apartment. Sloane was the one being careful. She was more attentive than usual, more interested in what I was doing in the evenings, more talkative about her day, more curious about mine, which would have been nice under different circumstances. There was an evening she came home with food she'd picked up from a place I liked. Didn't mention a reason. I said thanks, we ate, it was good. I didn't read into it much. One evening she asked to use my phone because hers was charging in the other room. I handed it over without thinking about it. She was on it for longer than it would take to look something up quickly. I could see from where I was sitting that she was in the Messages app. I didn't say anything at the time, but I thought about it afterward. My texts with Haley are completely boring to anyone who isn't either of us. Links to photography stuff, short reactions to things, practical back and forth about plans. Nothing in there that could be described as anything other than two people maintaining a normal friendship. But the fact that she was looking was interesting to sit with. Here's Sloane, who had told me that looking through your partner's phone is a sign of distrust and insecurity, who had explained that kind of behavior as exactly the sort of thing unhealthy relationships are built on. Checking my phone, I didn't bring it up, I didn't need to. A few days after that, she did start a conversation. We were home in the evening, nothing specific going on, and she started in a way that I recognized. The measured tone that meant she'd been thinking about how to start this conversation for a while. Said she'd noticed I'd been talking to Haley a lot lately. I said about the same as usual, maybe a bit more because of the exhibition and some photography stuff we'd been discussing. She said it seemed like more than that. I kept my expression neutral. She said she wanted to be honest and say that she was a little bothered by it. I waited to hear what came next. She said there was something about the frequency that felt off to her, that she wasn't saying I was doing anything wrong, but it just didn't sit right. I let her finish. Then I asked what specifically made her uncomfortable. She said the constant texting, the planning things together, the way it seemed to be accelerating. I said, okay, what about it specifically? She started to say something about the nature of the friendship, how it had shifted recently. And I said, slowly and without being aggressive about it, that she texted Caden every single day, and they met for coffee regularly. And that when I brought that up, she'd explained to me that friendship is friendship, and that having a problem with it was controlling behavior. She looked at me. I said I'd believed her and agreed with her, so I was applying the same logic to my own friendship. There was a long pause. She said that was different. I asked her to explain how. She thought about it for a moment and couldn't quite land on an explanation that held together. The closest she got was something about the progression of it, how it had intensified recently. I said her friendship with Caden had also continued developing over the course of our relationship, and I hadn't said anything about that. Another pause. Then she shifted, which I was expecting. Said that she felt like I was doing this on purpose, that this wasn't really about photography or friendship, that I was trying to make a point. I said I was just being consistent with the standard she'd established. She said using her own words as a weapon against her wasn't good faith behavior, that there was something passive-aggressive about the whole thing. I thought about a few different responses and chose the simplest one. Told her I wasn't using her words against her. I was using them the same way she'd always told me to use them, that if the standard was correct, it should work equally in both directions. If it only applied to her situations and became a problem when applied to mine, that was worth paying attention to. She didn't respond to that directly. Said she was tired and was going to bed and left the room. I sat there for a few minutes and then went to make tea. Texted Russ something short, just said, "Round 1. He replied in about 15 seconds. "Tell me everything." I said tomorrow. He said, "Fine, but I want all of it." Sent a string of "most patient man alive" memes, which I ignored. Nothing was resolved from that conversation. Sloan and I went about the next couple of days in that polite, careful mode that happens after a fight that wasn't technically a fight. Nothing warm, but nothing hostile, just functioning. Saying practical things to each other, sharing the kitchen without incident, maintaining the minimum operational requirements of two people living together. She didn't bring up Haley again during that stretch, and I didn't bring up Caden. Some amount of time after this, there was a gathering at a friend's place. Not a big party, just a handful of people getting together on a weekend, the usual crowd. Russ was there, which was rare for an event that also included Sloan. I was genuinely glad he was there. We were all sitting around in the living room, food and drinks, different conversations breaking off and rejoining the way they do. Comfortable enough evening, nothing tense on the surface. At some point, Sloan was talking to a couple of the other people there about relationships and communication, which was a topic she was good at and could hold a room with. She was saying something about how modern relationships have all these unhealthy patterns built in, how people project their own insecurities onto their partners without realizing it. The usual. Someone asked a follow-up, and Sloan said something about how jealousy over friendships was one of the most common examples of that. How it's fundamentally a trust issue, how emotionally developed people don't get threatened by their partner having close friends of the other gender. She said it with the easy authority of someone stating something everyone already agrees with. One of the people listening, a girl I didn't know that well, said something like, "Wait, but doesn't it depend on the specific dynamic?" Sloan said no, fundamentally it shouldn't. The principle is the principle. Then someone else in the group, one of the guys I did know, said, "So then you're totally cool with Nate and Haley spending time together?" Sloan went a bit still, not in a visible dramatic way, just a slight tightening. Said, "Yeah, of course." The guy said because he'd seen that Nate had been to some gallery thing with her recently. Looked like a fun afternoon. Sloan said yes, she knew about it. She'd known from the start. Then the first girl said, "Oh nice, so you guys both have that kind of setup going. Like you each have a close friend of the other gender, and it's just normalized." Sloan said, "Mm-hmm." The kind of affirmation that's technically a yes, but sounds like someone choosing their footing carefully on ice. The girl said that was really healthy, actually, that a lot of couples can't manage that. Sloane smiled and said, "Yeah, trust is everything." Russ, who had been sitting quietly to my left with his drink for the last several minutes, said in a completely neutral tone that, yeah, it was a solid setup. Nobody thought anything of it except me and Russ. I looked at him. He had a very small smile that he was working hard not to let become a larger smile. Sloane changed the subject shortly after, and the conversation moved on to something else. But I'd seen the moment, the one where she'd had to agree out loud, in front of other people, with the exact position she'd spent a year and a half stating, while visibly not being okay with the application of that position. We drove home after mostly quiet. Sloane was looking out the window at passing streetlights. I kept the radio on at a low volume. She didn't say anything in the car. When we got back to the apartment, she put her bag down, sat on the couch, and said she needed to talk. I sat down across from her. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking, said that she still believed what she'd always said about friendships and trust, that she stood by the principle, but that in practice she was finding it harder than she'd expected, that feelings don't automatically align with beliefs, that knowing something is the right position doesn't make the feeling disappear. I listened to all of it. She went on for a while, circling around the center of what she was trying to say. Something about how this was bringing up things in her she hadn't expected to feel, that maybe she needed to sit with why this felt different to her, what it was really about. By the time she paused, I'd been listening for a few minutes. I waited a moment, then said one thing, said, "You know, this is exactly how I felt about Caden." She looked at me. I said the whole time, from pretty early on, I noticed that dynamic and it bothered me, that I tried to tell her that once and got a conversation about toxic masculinity and my inability to trust, that I dropped it and didn't bring it up again after that, but that the feeling didn't go away. I just figured out I wasn't allowed to have it. She didn't say anything. So I kept going, said that the difference between us in this situation was that when she had a feeling she couldn't explain, she could name it and bring it to the table. That when I had the exact same feeling, I was handed a vocabulary list describing what it revealed about my character. That I wasn't doing any of this to punish her or prove something petty. I'd just finally stopped managing myself around a rule that had never actually been designed to apply in both directions. She was quiet for a long time after that. Not the kind of quiet where someone is preparing a counterpoint. Just actual quiet, like she was genuinely sitting with it. Then she started speaking again and said she hadn't realized, that she didn't mean for it to work that way, that she genuinely believed what she'd been saying and hadn't thought about what it meant on the other side. I said I knew that, said the problem wasn't that she was being deliberately dishonest, it was that she'd designed a principle for my behavior and never actually tested whether she could live by it herself. She said that was hard to hear. I said I knew that too. Another long pause. She said she wanted to work on this, that she could hear what I was saying, and that she owed me an honest conversation about it, that she wanted to be actually consistent, not just in theory. And I looked at her and I thought about a year and a half. The dropped conversations, the lectures, the low-grade work of making myself smaller to fit the acceptable version of a partner she had in her head. The way she'd explained my own feelings back to me as defects in my character. The way she'd said okay when I told her about the exhibition, that single hollow okay with everything it was trying not to say. The phone she'd gone through, the girl at the party saying how healthy and mature it was while Sloane sat there agreeing through a fixed smile. I thought about all of that for a moment. Then I stood up. She looked up at me. I went to the bedroom, opened the closet, got my bag out, and started putting things in it. Not everything, just what I needed for a few days. Charger, some clothes, toiletries, the usual. Sloane came to the doorway and asked what I was doing. I said I needed some space. Her voice changed, went higher and faster. Said I was overreacting, that we'd just been having a conversation, that I was making this bigger than it needed to be. I kept packing. She said walking out mid-conversation was not a healthy way to handle conflict, that if I had problems with how things had been going, we needed to talk them out, not run away from them. That this was exactly the kind of avoidant behavior that makes things worse. I thought about pointing out that framing my exit as another example of my emotional dysfunction was a pretty familiar move, but I didn't say it. I zipped the bag, turned to her, and said it quietly. Not angry, not dramatic, just clearly. Said that she'd built the rules for a long time, and I'd followed them. That it turned out she hadn't actually believed them either, not when it came to her own comfort. and that was worth knowing. She said my name the way people do when they're trying to get you to stop and reconsider. I picked up the bag and walked past her to the front door. She was saying something else, but I wasn't tracking the words anymore. Opened the door, stepped out, closed it behind me. Not a slam, just a door closing. I stood in the hallway for a second, just standing there in the quiet. The door to the apartment next to ours had a little wreath on it that had been there since a holiday a while back. Slightly crooked, nobody had taken it down. I looked at it for no reason. Then I went down to my car, sat in the driver's seat in the parking lot for a minute, doing nothing in particular. Some cars in the lot, a light on and a window across the way, nothing moving. Then I got my phone out and texted Russ, just said, "Are you free tonight?" He replied in about 30 seconds, asked if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, actually yeah." He said, "Then get over here. I have leftover pizza and a terrible movie queue." I started the car, drove over to his place. We watched something completely stupid on his TV, ate cold pizza, didn't talk about most of it. At some point, he asked once, around midnight or so, if I was sure about the whole thing. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay." Handed me the remote and let me pick the next thing. Didn't push it further. That's what a good friend does. Sloan sent a few messages over the following days. I read all of them. The first one said she'd been thinking, that she understood what I meant, that she owed me a real conversation and a real apology. Then some that were more hurt, asking why I wasn't responding, saying that silence wasn't fair either. Then a couple that went back to analysis mode, explaining what she thought had happened in the relationship, what she thought each of us needed to work on. One of them had the phrase emotional unavailability in it, which I noticed. I read every one and didn't reply. Not out of cruelty. There was just nothing I wanted to say yet. Maybe at some point there would be, but not then. Russ didn't push me toward any particular outcome. Just let me exist at his place for a couple of days. Fed me pizza, made no speeches. We talked about the game, about work things, about something he'd been watching. Normal stuff. Good guy. I texted Haley at some point and told her what had happened in broad strokes. Not the whole thing, just enough. She said she was sorry, asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said, not really. She said, okay, let her know if that changed. That was the right response. Didn't offer unsolicited opinions, didn't ask for details, just acknowledged it and backed off. I went back to my apartment after a few days. Sloan had been staying at a friend's place in the meantime. We'd communicated that much. I cleaned the apartment, went grocery shopping, answered the work tickets that had built up, made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a while, just existing. Looked at the wall and thought about nothing specific. I didn't have the feeling that I'd done something wrong. That's maybe the most honest thing I can write about all of it. Not relief exactly, not victory, nothing dramatic, just clear. Like some process that had been running quietly in the background of everything for a year and a half had finally finished and closed. The rule was the rule. She made it, applied it to me, explained it to me, used it in arguments. I followed it. Turns out the rule was only ever supposed to point in one direction. And once that became impossible to ignore, everything else stopped making sense. I don't know what comes next, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm not making grand statements about relationships or women or what any of this means beyond the specific situation. It's just a thing that happened, a very specific and somewhat ironic thing that happened. She set the rules, I played by them. The end.